The morning Reverend Croft climbed the steps of the Dusthaven Baptist Church and declared before God and 43 witnesses that no decent man in the territory would ever take Hazel Covington for a wife. Hugh Keller was leaning against the post outside the Silver Spur saloon with a cigarette between his teeth and absolutely no intention of becoming anyone's husband. That was how it started. Not with a moonlit ride across the prairie or a stolen glance over a church hymnal. It started with a preacher's cruelty and a gambler's pride. On a Tuesday morning in September of 1882, in the sun-baked cattle town of Dusthaven, New Mexico Territory. Hazel Covington had come to Dusthaven 6 months earlier with her father, a traveling watchmaker named Edmund Covington, who fixed timepieces and pocket watches, and occasionally sold snake oil remedies from the back of a painted wagon. Edmund was not a bad man. He was simply a weak one, which in the territory often amounted to the same thing. He had a taste for whiskey and a habit of borrowing money he never repaid, and when he died of a rattlesnake bite in early April of 1882, he left Hazel with $42, a broken pocket watch, and a reputation as peculiar as her situation. She was 23 years old, unmarried and alone, which was scandal enough for a town like Dusthaven. But the real trouble was the month she had spent working at the Silver Spur, not as a saloon girl, not in the way the gossips preferred to imagine. She had washed dishes and kept the books for the saloon owner, a broad-shouldered Irishman named Declan Fogarty, because it was the only work available and because she had to eat. But in the moral arithmetic of a small frontier town in 1882, a woman who entered the Silver Spur under any circumstances was a woman of compromised character, and nothing she did after that could fully wash the taint away. She had since moved on to work as a seamstress, renting a small room above the hardware store from a widow named Mrs. Delacroix. She kept to herself. She attended services. She did her work quietly and without complaint. She was, by any honest measure, a hard-working and decent young woman doing her best in circumstances that had given her very little room to maneuver. None of that mattered to Reverend Croft. The Reverend was a thin man with a sharp nose and pale eyes that seemed perpetually disappointed in everything they observed. He had been in Dusthaven for 4 years, long enough to have established himself as the moral authority of the community, which was a position he occupied with tremendous enthusiasm and very little kindness. He had preached against card playing, against dancing, against the consumption of spirits, and against the Covington woman in particular, though he had been somewhat subtle about that last part until this particular Tuesday. What had brought things to a head was the matter of Thomas Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore was the son of the largest cattle rancher in the county, a young man of 26 with soft hands and good teeth, and a mother who had decided, apparently without consulting Thomas, that Hazel Covington was beneath the family's consideration as a potential match. Thomas had made the mistake of being seen walking with Hazel twice in 1 week, and once he had carried her parcels from the general store, and that was enough for his mother to march directly to Reverend Croft and have a private conversation that lasted the better part of an hour. By the following Sunday, the Reverend had worked himself into a state. And by Tuesday morning, when the church was holding a community prayer meeting about the upcoming harvest, he had decided that the moment had arrived to make his position clear. He did not mention Hazel by name during the meeting. He spoke in the manner of men who want to wound without being held directly accountable, talking about women of uncertain moral standing who preyed upon the sons of decent families, about Eve in the garden, about wolves in sheep's clothing. Every person in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. Hazel sat in the third pew from the back, her hands folded in her lap, her chin level, and she listened to every word of it. It was afterward, when people were filing out into the sharp September sunshine, that Thomas Whitmore's mother said something to a cluster of women near the church steps, something about how she pitied any man foolish enough to tie himself to such a woman. And Reverend Croft, standing nearby with his thumbs in his belt, said loudly enough for a dozen people to hear, "No decent man would have her. The Lord has made that plain enough." Hazel heard it. She was 3 steps from the bottom of the stairs, and she stopped, and for a moment she seemed to have turned to stone. Hugh Keller heard it too. He had not been at the prayer meeting. He had been doing what he did most Tuesday mornings, which was sitting outside the Silver Spur with a cigarette and a cup of coffee that Declan Fogarty sent out for him, watching Dusthaven wake up. He had a view of the church from where he sat, and he had watched the congregation file out, and he had not been paying particular attention until the Reverend's voice carried across the dry morning air with that particular clarity that mean words always seem to have. Hugh Keller was 30 years old, brown from years in the sun, with dark eyes and dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had been broken once, and had healed slightly wrong so that his face had a faint asymmetry that made him look permanently skeptical. He wore a gun on his hip the way most men in the territory did, but he was not what the novels called a gunfighter. He was a professional gambler primarily, and a man who hired himself out for various tasks that required nerve and very little reputation to protect. He had driven cattle. He had served briefly as a deputy marshal in a town in Arizona before being politely asked to leave when his gambling was deemed an embarrassment to the office. He was, as Reverend Croft himself had noted in a sermon some months back, not the kind of man any respectable family wanted in their parlor. He heard the Reverend say what he said, and he watched Hazel Covington stop on those church steps, and he watched the way her back straightened and her chin came up, and the way she walked the rest of the way down those steps without looking at anyone, walking straight and careful the way a person walks when they are absolutely determined not to let anyone see them break. He had seen her before. The town was not large. He had seen her working at Declan's place in those early weeks, had noticed the way she kept the books without being asked, the neat handwriting on the ledger pages, the quiet competence of her. He had seen her afterward at the seamstress work, had once left a shirt that needed mending and found when he picked it up that she had fixed not just the tear he had pointed out but also a frayed cuff he had not mentioned, and charged him nothing extra for it. He had thought, in the distant way a man thinks about something when he is not allowing himself to think too seriously, that she was a remarkable person to have washed up in a place like Dusthaven. He had not until that morning thought about what Dusthaven was doing to her. He stubbed out his cigarette on the porch post and watched her walk up the street toward the hardware store with her back very straight, and something shifted in his chest that he could not entirely account for. It was not pity, exactly. He had no patience for pity as an emotion. It was something closer to anger on her behalf, and something else beneath that, something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. He was inside the Silver Spur and back at the card table by mid-morning, and he told himself he had filed the matter away and moved on. But he had not moved on. He found himself, over the following 3 days, thinking about Hazel Covington in the specific way that people think about something they are pretending not to think about. He thought about the way she had straightened her back on those stairs. He thought about the frayed cuff on the shirt. He thought about the fact that she was alone in this town, and that the town had decided to make her loneliness as sharp-edged as possible. On Thursday evening, he was playing poker with 3 cattle buyers and a land speculator when Declan Fogarty pulled up a chair and leaned inconspiratorially during a break in the game. "That Covington girl is looking for another room," Declan said quietly. "Mrs. Delacroix gave her notice. Said the Reverend told her it was bad for business to have that woman above her husband's store." Hugh organized his cards with great care and said nothing. "I'm just saying," Declan continued, "that somebody ought to do something. She's a good person, better than most in this town deserve." "Why are you telling me?" Hugh asked. Declan gave him a look that suggested he was not asking a sincere question. "Because you've been asking about her since Tuesday and trying to make it look like you haven't," he said, and got up before Hugh could respond. Hugh lost the next 3 hands, which was not like him. He went to see her on Friday morning. He found her at the small table outside Mrs. Delacroix's hardware store, where she had been permitted to sit and do her sewing work even though she was no longer welcome to sleep in the room above it. She had a blue wool jacket in her lap and a needle in her hand, and she looked up when his shadow fell across her, and her expression was the careful, neutral expression of someone who had learned to look neutrally at every approach because any approach might be another problem. "Miss Covington," he said. "Mr. Keller," she said. Her voice was even and clear, a slightly lower register than he expected from a woman of her size, which he found immediately and unreasonably appealing. He held his hat in his hands, which was something he did when he was nervous and was aware he was nervous and was trying to do something with his hands about it. "I heard you're looking for a room. That is not your business, Mr. Keller." "I know it isn't," he said. "I'm making it my business." She looked at him steadily. She had gray eyes, he noticed, the particular gray of storm clouds building over mountains, and they held his gaze with the same straightforwardness her back had shown on those church steps. "Why would you do that?" He considered lying. He was very good at lying, professionally speaking. He decided not to. "Because what the Reverend said was wrong, and because this town has been unkind to you, and because I have 2 empty rooms above the assay office that I use for storage, and you could have one of them for $3 a month, which is fair." She was quiet for a moment. She turned her needle over in her fingers. "People will talk," she said. "People are already talking," he said, "and I have never once in my life cared what people said about me. I figure that's a quality that might suit your situation right now." Something moved through her expression, very briefly, that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "You own the assay office." "I have a part interest in it," he said. "Lou Faber runs the operation, he's got the other part. He works downstairs, I've got the upper floor. The rooms above are yours to let. If you want them, yes." She was quiet again. He watched her work through the decision, saw the moment when practicality won over caution. "I would need a proper bolt on the door," she said. "I'll have it installed this afternoon." She looked at him one more time, the gray eyes doing something careful and deliberate, as though she was reading a document and wanted to be sure of its terms. Then she said, $3 a month, and I cook my own meals and keep my own hours, and no one comes to that door without being invited." "Agreed," he said. "Then I accept, Mr. Keller, thank you." He put his hat back on and turned to go, and then he stopped and turned back because there was something else he wanted to say and had been trying to decide whether to say it. "For what it's worth," he said, "the Reverend is a small man in a big coat." What he said had nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with his. She looked at him for a long moment, and this time what moved across her face was not in the neighborhood of a smile. It was something older and less guarded than that. "That is a kind thing to say," she said, "even from the least decent man in town." He laughed, which surprised him. It surprised her too, he thought. "Who told you I was the least decent man in town?" "Mrs. Calloway, Mrs. Faber, Reverend Croft, various others." "Well," he said, "they're probably right." "Probably," she agreed, and there was just the ghost of something in her voice that suggested she was not entirely certain. The bolt was installed by 3 that afternoon. Hazel moved her 2 bags and her sewing kit and her small stack of books into the room by 4. It was a clean room, she discovered, which surprised her. Hugh Keller had apparently cleared the storage out himself and swept the floor and found a decent rug from somewhere, and left it on the floor with a note that said simply, "The window sticks, push from the bottom left corner." She stood in the middle of the room with her bags at her feet and read the note twice, and felt something in her chest that had been tight for a very long time loosened by a single careful degree. She did not see Hugh that evening. She unpacked her things and sat by the window and watched the last light drain out of the September sky over the flat New Mexico desert, the mountains in the distance going purple and then black, the first stars appearing one by one over the flat rim of the world. And she thought about how strange it was that a gambler with a questionable reputation had done more for her comfort in one afternoon than the entire righteous community of Dusthaven had managed in 6 months. She decided not to think about what that meant. She had enough to manage already. In the morning she woke early, as she always did, and went downstairs to find that Hugh had left a pot of coffee on the small iron stove in the narrow kitchen off the hallway, with a second cup sitting next to it. Just the one extra cup, no note, no fanfare. She poured herself a cup and drank it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the alley behind the assay office where 2 cats were negotiating over a piece of dried meat. Hugh came downstairs 20 minutes later looking like a man who had stayed up late and had no regrets about it, dark circles and dark stubble and rumpled shirt, and he stopped when he saw her at the window as though he had not expected her to be there, even though he had left an extra cup specifically so that she could be. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "The coffee is good. Lou brings it from Santa Fe when he makes the supply run. None of that local stuff." He moved past her to pour his own cup, and they stood for a moment in the small kitchen in the early September light without talking, and it was not uncomfortable, which was the first surprising thing about it. She cooked breakfast for herself that morning and made extra without asking him, leaving a plate on the table, and when she came back an hour later the plate was clean and washed and drying on the rack. That was how it began, the daily texture of it. The small negotiations of 2 people sharing a building who were careful with each other in the precise way that people are careful when they have both been burned before. She kept her hours. He kept his. They passed in the hallway and on the stairs. They drank coffee in the mornings. And gradually, so gradually it was like watching a door swing open on a windless day, they began to talk. She learned that he was from Missouri originally, that he had come west at 18 with a man named Garrett who had been something between a mentor and a confidence artist, that he had parted ways with Garrett in Tucson under circumstances he described only as educational. She learned that he had a mother he wrote to in St. Louis, and that the letters were long, and that he was more loyal to her than his general air of indifference would suggest. She learned that he read, which surprised her, that he had a shelf of actual books in his room, Dickens and Cooper, and a worn copy of Thoreau that looked like it had been read so many times it was held together mostly by habit. He learned that she had grown up in a real house in Kansas City, that her mother had died when she was 15, and that her father had begun his slow drift westward after that she had learned to sew from her grandmother and to keep books from her father in one of his more lucid periods, that she was not, as the gossips had painted her, careless with herself or her choices. She was, in fact, the most methodical person he had ever met. She had a list of what she wanted from her life, neatly written in the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and it included things like a garden with a proper fence and a room that was hers that no one could remove her from, and though she did not show him the list, she told him enough of it that he understood the shape of it. October came in warm and dry, the way New Mexico Octobers do, the sky a hard bright blue and the air tasting of juniper and dust. Hazel's seamstress work had expanded. She had taken on alterations for the 2 largest ranches in the county and had found a steady supply of mending work from the cowboys who came through on the cattle drives, and her situation was, financially speaking, more stable than it had been at any point since her father died. She realized one morning, almost happy. The realization arrived with the slight alarm of something unexpected. The problems had not gone away. Reverend Croft had made a point of mentioning from the pulpit that certain members of the community were making choices that reflected poorly on the town's moral character, and while he still did not say her name directly, everyone knew who he meant. Mrs. Whitmore had organized what she called the Ladies' Charitable Society in a way that seemed specifically designed to exclude Hazel from any social network that might give her more security. Thomas Whitmore himself had stopped coming near her entirely, which was a relief as much as anything because Thomas had never truly interested her, but it illustrated the reach of the Reverend's influence. Hugh was aware of all of this. He was, despite appearances, an attentive man, and he watched the currents of the town with the careful eye of someone who had spent years reading people across card tables. He said nothing directly. He was not the kind of man who spoke about things indirectly, but he was also, she was learning, not the kind of man who leaped without thought. What he did was simpler and more effective. When she walked through town, and the knot of women outside the millinery shop turned away, he happened to be walking in the same direction, and he touched the brim of his hat to her in plain sight of everyone, and said good morning in the comfortable tone of a man speaking to someone he considered his equal, and held the door of the general store open for her, and waited while she made her purchases, and carried the heavier bag back to the assay office for her. He did not make a production of it. He simply did it consistently in public without apology. She noticed. She did not comment on it, but she noticed. One evening in the second week of October, a cold front came through and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 2 hours, the kind of fast, hard cold that catches the desert off guard, and she had not laid in enough firewood for the stove in her room. She knocked on Hugh's door, which she had not done before, and when he opened it, he was in his shirt sleeves with a book in his hand, and he looked at her, and she said with great dignity, "I am sorry to bother you, but I am rather cold." He looked at her for a half-second with an expression she could not read, and then he said, "Come in." And she did. And he put more wood on his own stove and brought her the Thoreau from the shelf and a wool blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed. And they sat on opposite sides of his small room and read in the warmth for 2 hours without speaking more than a dozen words. And it was the most comfortable she had felt in longer than she could easily remember. When she got up to go back to her own room, which by then was warm enough from the shared wall, she paused at his door and said, "What is it that you actually want, Mr. Keller? From your life, I mean. Not in the immediate way." He looked up from his book. He had obviously been expecting something else, a thank you perhaps, and the question caught him off guard in a way that was apparently rare. He thought about it for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Something that doesn't require me to be someone else to have it." She thought about that for a moment. Then she nodded once, as though a question she had not known she was asking had been answered, and said good night and went to her room and lay awake for a while, thinking about the man on the other side of the wall and what his answer meant. November brought the cattle drives to a close, and the town quieted, the drovers moving on and the streets losing their summer roughness. Hugh had been engaged in a business arrangement with a man named Vargas who ran cattle between New Mexico and Texas, and the arrangement concluded with a sum of money that left Hugh in reasonably good standing financially, and with no immediate need to do much of anything for a few weeks. He spent some of those weeks in Hazel's company, in the way that had become natural between them. They walked sometimes in the evenings after her sewing was done, out along the flat road that ran east of town where the desert opened up, and you could see the mountains clearly and the sky was enormous. He told her about games he had played and men he had known, and she told him about Kansas City and the house she had grown up in and the things her mother had taught her. They talked easily. They argued occasionally about books and about politics, and about the question of whether the railroad coming through the territory was a blessing or a destruction, and their arguments were good ones, the kind where both people are genuinely interested in being challenged. He had started, some weeks ago, doing something that he had not told himself he was doing, which was looking at Hazel Covington the way a man looks at a woman when he is trying to memorize her. The particular angle of her jaw, the way she tucked her hair back when she was thinking hard, the small scar below her left ear that she had, she told him once when he asked, from falling off a fence at age 7 while trying to see a horse her father had promised her. He knew these details now the way he knew the worn spots on his favorite deck of cards, by repeated contact, by attention he could not stop paying. He had not said anything. He was, for all his apparent recklessness, cautious where it counted, and what he felt for Hazel Covington was beginning to matter enough to him that the idea of handling it badly was genuinely concerning. The situation broke open on the first Saturday of December, and it broke open because of Reverend Croft, which in retrospect was probably inevitable. There was a dance. The Dusthaven community held a winter dance each December, in the large barn that belonged to the Whitmore Ranch, and it was the social event of the season, the thing that everyone attended regardless of their standing, because in a small frontier town in the winter, there was not enough social life to permit boycotts. Hazel had been uncertain about going. The last thing she needed was another public setting in which Reverend Croft could make her feel like something that had blown in under the door. But Hugh had said simply, "Come to the dance," and something in the directness of it, the lack of qualification, made her say yes. They arrived together, which was itself a statement, though neither of them made it feel like one. He had cleaned up considerably, she noted, the dark hair cut and combed, and a good jacket she had not seen before, and she had put on the blue dress she had been altering for herself over the past 3 weeks, a dark blue wool with small buttons at the cuff that she had taken in and remade from a larger garment she had found at the dry goods store. He looked at her when she came down the stairs and he said, "You look very well," in a tone that was direct and quiet and meant it, and she said, "Thank you," in a tone that suggested she knew he meant it and was not going to make it into something small by deflecting it. The dance was crowded and warm, the barn lit with lanterns and the fiddler playing from a platform at the far end. People were dancing in the center and standing in groups along the walls, and children were running around the periphery being ignored. Hazel navigated it with her chin level and her expression pleasant, and Hugh walked with her and got her a cup of cider from the table near the door, and for the first hour it was almost normal. Then Reverend Croft materialized beside them with a woman from the church ladies group on one side and Thomas Whitmore's mother on the other, and his pale eyes went from Hugh to Hazel and back to Hugh with the expression of a man encountering exactly what he expected to encounter and was prepared to say something about. "Mr. Keller," he said, "I had not expected to see you here." "It's a public dance, Reverend," Hugh said pleasantly. The Reverend's gaze moved to Hazel. "Miss Covington," he said, with a weight on the miss that suggested she should feel its edge, "I hope you are finding our community welcoming." It was the kind of thing a mean person says when they want to indicate the opposite. Hazel recognized it. She had heard enough of its variants to fill a book. Before she could respond, Hugh said in the same pleasant tone, "She is. Though I wonder sometimes if the community is fully aware of what a capable and decent woman it has in its midst." He paused. "I'm sure you make note of these things in your pastoral capacity, Reverend." It was not aggressive. It was not, technically, even confrontational. It was perfectly civil and perfectly clear, and it landed like a stone in a still pool, the ripples going outward through the small cluster of people nearby who had all been listening while pretending not to. The Reverend's expression went through several things very quickly. He settled on a kind of careful dignity and said, "I preach what I believe is right, Mr. Keller. A woman's reputation is a serious matter." "It is," Hugh agreed. "Which is why I take it seriously when people damage one unjustly." Mrs. Whitmore made a sound. The Reverend's jaw tightened. Hugh smiled, and it was a genuine smile, the one he had that contained absolutely nothing friendly in it, and he offered Hazel his arm and said, "I believe the fiddler is starting a reel." She took his arm and they walked toward the dancing, and behind them there was a silence that was more eloquent than anything the Reverend might have said to fill it. They danced 3 dances, and Hugh was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him, and he said he had learned in a saloon in Albuquerque from a woman who ran it, and who believed everyone should know how to move decently in a small space. And Hazel laughed, and it was real laughter, the kind that comes from somewhere below the careful surface. It was during the 4th song, a slower one the fiddler played with real feeling, that they were standing closer than they had before, and she looked at him directly and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, Thank you for what you said to him." He looked down at her, and his expression was different from his usual expression, less armored and more direct, and he said, "I meant every word of it." She held his gaze. "I know you did. That is what made it matter." They were standing very close. The barn was warm and full of light, and the fiddle music was old and sweet, and something had shifted in the space between them that neither of them was pretending had not shifted. "Hazel," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, the first time he had not said Miss Covington, and the way he said it was careful and deliberate, the way he said things he meant. "I know," she said, and she did know. She had known for weeks, in the way you know things you have been thinking about from the corner of your eye, not looking at them directly because looking directly changes everything. He did not kiss her. Not that night in the barn, with 40 people around them and the Reverend still somewhere in the room. He was better than that. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then the music changed to something fast and lively, and they both stepped back to the proper distance, and the moment settled into the foundation of things without being fully named. She could not sleep when they got home. She lay in her room with the December cold pressing against the window, and the stars very bright, and she thought about Hugh Keller with the careful intensity of someone taking inventory of something valuable. What she had for him was not the dizzy, stumbling thing she had read about in novels, the thing that was mostly about the other person's appearance and very little about who they actually were. What she had for him was something that had roots. It had grown from knowing him, from the coffee cups and the evenings by the stove and the arguments about Thoreau, and the way he had spoken to Reverend Croft tonight without flinching. And what it felt like, she thought, lying there in the dark, was like finding something she had not known she was looking for, but that fit exactly the shape of what was missing. She was also, she admitted to herself, fairly certain that he felt the same. The evidence was significant, and she had been reading it carefully. He came downstairs earlier than usual the next morning and found her already at the kitchen table with her coffee and her sewing, and he sat down across from her and poured his coffee and said without preamble, "I would like to court you properly, if that is something you would consider." She kept her eyes on her sewing for a moment, making one careful stitch. Then she looked up. "What does properly mean to you, given your reputation?" He almost smiled. "It means with your knowledge and agreement and at a pace that suits you. It means I am asking you directly instead of assuming, which I believe is a reasonable definition of proper." She considered him. "You are aware that the town will have opinions. The town can have as many opinions as it likes. I have never once run my life to satisfy Dusthaven's expectations, and I don't intend to start. And the Reverend is the least of my concerns." She put her sewing down. She looked at him steadily with those gray eyes that had been reading him so carefully for so many weeks. "All right, Hugh," she said, using his name deliberately, watching the effect of it on his face. "Then I will consider it." She was smiling now. Not a ghost of it, but the real thing, and it transformed her face in a way that made him feel slightly unsteady, which was not something he was accustomed to feeling. "Good," he said, and picked up his coffee and hid behind it somewhat, and she picked up her sewing and her smile remained. He courted her through December and into January of 1883, in all the ways that were available to a man in a frontier town in winter. He brought her books from the small collection that passed through the hands of the assay office's previous owner. He cooked Sunday dinner once a week, and it turned out he was a capable cook, learned from the same woman in Albuquerque who had taught him to dance, and the meals were good, and they lasted long because neither of them was in a hurry to be done talking. He took her riding on the days when the weather permitted, on horses he borrowed from the livery stable, and they rode out into the desert where the winter light was low and golden, and turned the red earth to something close to copper, and talked, and were silent in the comfortable way of people who have passed the point where silence is awkward. He told her, on one of those rides, about the thing that had happened in Arizona that had ended his time as a deputy marshal. It was more complicated than being politely asked to leave for gambling. There had been a man in the town, a prominent man, who had been doing something systematically cruel to a family who worked on his land, a Mexican family with no recourse and no one willing to listen. And Hugh had made it plain to the man that it would stop. And when the man had gone to the marshal, and the marshal had sided with the prominent man, Hugh had done several things in response that were effective and not entirely legal, and had then resigned before anyone could take formal action. The family had been able to stay. The prominent man had lost some portion of his prominence and most of his composure. Hugh had moved on to New Mexico. She listened to this without interruption, and when he was done, she said, "That was the right thing to do." "It cost me the position," he said. "The position wasn't worth having if it required you to look the other way," she said. "You know that. That's why you did it." He looked at her sideways from his horse. "Most people would call that reckless." "Most people call a lot of things reckless that are actually just inconvenient for them," she said, and he laughed the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere genuine, and she felt the warmth of having caused it. January was cold and clear, the kind of cold that is honest about itself, the sky a deep blue and the ground hard, and the nights lit with more stars than seemed reasonable. Hugh had taken to building the fire in Hazel's stove on the evenings when he came back after she had already gone up, so that when she woke the room would not be stone cold, and she had taken to leaving dinner in a pot for him when he was out late, and neither of them had discussed these habits directly. They had simply accumulated around the two of them like evidence. It was on a Wednesday evening in the third week of January, sitting by the fire in the downstairs room with the cold pressing against the windows, that he reached over and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture. Just that, his hand over hers, and he held it, and they kept talking about whatever they had been talking about. She had been telling him about her grandmother's garden in Kansas City and the particular roses that came up every spring, and he held her hand and listened with his full attention, and she kept talking, but her whole body was aware of his hand and the warmth of it and the steadiness of it. Later, when she was saying good night at the foot of the stairs, he still had her hand. He turned it over and looked at it in the lantern light, the small calluses from her needlework, the ink stain on her right forefinger from the ledger work she still did occasionally for Declan Fogarty, and he pressed his lips to the back of it, quietly and without show, and then looked at her. She leaned forward and kissed him, which surprised him somewhat and pleased him enormously, and it was a brief kiss but an honest one, and when she stepped back there was color in her cheeks, and she said good night and went upstairs. And he stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment, looking at the place where she had been and feeling something that he had not felt in so long he had nearly forgotten the address of it. February brought a problem. The problem's name was Carter Hale, and he had arrived in Dusthaven with 3 other men who worked for a land developer out of Denver, a man who was buying up properties in the territory in the way that men with money and lawyers were beginning to do in 1882 and 1883, taking advantage of the complicated questions around land titles in the former Mexican territory. The assay office sat on a piece of land whose title was, it turned out, in a state of legal ambiguity that Hale's employer's lawyers had identified as exploitable. Lou Faber, who was 62 and not in good health, was in no position to fight a legal battle over the title, and he came to Hugh in some distress in the second week of February to explain the situation. Hugh spent 4 days reading through the documents and then wrote 2 letters, one to a lawyer in Santa Fe that he trusted and one to the Territorial Land Office in the capital, and sent both by express rider. During those 4 days he was preoccupied and quieter than usual, and Hazel noticed and did not press. But on the 4th evening she brought coffee to where he was sitting at the table surrounded by documents and sat down across from him and waited. And he looked up and told her everything, because it was Hazel, and he had stopped feeling the need to manage things away from her. She listened, asked 2 questions that showed she had understood the legal shape of the problem immediately, and then said, "My father kept his records in a particular way. When a title was disputed, he would note the original deed holder and trace the chain. If I looked at these documents, I might be able to see something. He slid the documents across the table, and she spent 2 hours going through them while he drank his coffee and watched her, and felt something he could only describe as a kind of profound gratitude for her existence. She found an error in the chain of title that Hale's lawyers had either missed or were hoping no one would notice. A recording discrepancy from 1876 that established the prior claim clearly. Hugh took it to the Santa Fe lawyer when the man arrived 10 days later, and between that and the letter to the land office, the challenge to the assay office title was quietly dropped. Lou Faber, when Hugh explained that Hazel had found the key error, came to thank her himself. He was not a demonstrative man, Lou Faber, but he shook her hand and looked at her with his old eyes and said, "Miss Covington, you are a remarkable woman," and she thanked him and said it had been a puzzle and she liked puzzles. And when Lou had gone back downstairs, Hugh looked at her from across the room and said, "He's right, you know." She raised an eyebrow. "He's absolutely right," Hugh said more quietly. "You are remarkable." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Hugh, what are we doing?" He knew what she meant. Not the documents, not the legal situation. "I think," he said carefully, "that we are being honest with each other in a way that neither of us has had a great deal of practice with." "I don't want it to stop," she said, simply, directly, in the Hazel way that he had come to love, the way she cut to the center of things without ceremony. "It is not going to stop," he said, with a certainty he felt all the way through, the kind of certainty that does not need to be examined. March came in with wind and a late cold snap. And then the cold broke and there were 2 weeks of warm, fall spring days where the desert bloomed with the small yellow flowers that come up briefly on the flat ground east of town and then are gone. And they walked in the evenings through the flower-covered flat land with the evening light turning everything gold and the air smelling of sage and something clean. And on one of these evenings he stopped walking and turned to face her and said, "I want to marry you." She looked at him. The light was going golden and the flowers were all around them, and the mountains were very clear on the horizon. She was 23 years old, and she had spent the better part of a year being told by the town of Dusthaven that she was not worthy of a decent life. And standing here in the desert light with Hugh Keller looking at her the way he was looking at her, she felt something in the long-held tension of herself slowly and completely release. "I want to marry you too," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a ring, which meant he had planned this, had thought about it carefully enough to have the ring ready, and she looked at it. It was a simple gold band with a single small turquoise stone set in it, the turquoise from the territory, very blue-green in the evening light. "I bought it from the silversmith on Main Street," he said. "The turquoise is from the mountains east of here. I thought it suited you better than something pretentious." She held out her hand and he put it on her finger and it fit, which she found touching in a way she could not immediately articulate, the fact that he had thought to know the size. "How did you know it would fit?" she asked. "You leave your sewing ring on the kitchen windowsill," he said. "I borrowed it briefly to give to the silversmith for sizing." "I apologize for the deception," she laughed. "I will allow the deception," she said. He held her hand in both of his in the desert, with the last light going gold around them and the small yellow flowers at their feet, and she looked at the ring on her finger and then at him, and he was looking at her with the undivided attention of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for. "When?" she asked. "Soon," he said. "Before someone finds a reason to complicate it." The someone who found a reason to complicate it, and no one who knew Dusthaven was surprised, was Reverend Croft. The news of the engagement moved through the town with the speed that news always moves through small places, which is to say it was universally known by the following morning. By that afternoon, the Reverend had sent a note to the assay office addressed to Hugh alone, requesting a meeting, which Hugh read and set aside, and then a second note addressed to Hazel that was not. She told Hugh when she read it at the kitchen table with her coffee growing cold, precisely a note of congratulation. The Reverend wrote that he felt it his pastoral duty to counsel both parties before any union was sanctioned, that he had concerns of a spiritual nature regarding the circumstances under which this attachment had developed, and that he believed the town's interests were best served by careful consideration before any rash action was taken. The language was ornate and the meaning was plain. He did not intend to perform the ceremony. He doesn't have to perform it, Hugh said, from the doorway where he was leaning with his arms folded, reading the same note over her shoulder. There is no other pastor within 40 miles, she said. There is a justice of the peace in Mescal Creek, he said. We do not need Elias Croft. She thought about this. There was something in her, she acknowledged honestly to herself, that had wanted the church, the proper ceremony, the public acknowledgement that she was not what the Reverend had said she was, that a good man had chosen her and was not ashamed of it. She had wanted, a small and painful part of her admitted, for it to happen in plain sight. Hugh, watching her, seemed to understand this without her saying it. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Come with me." They walked to the church. Reverend Croft was in his office at the back of the building, a small room with too many papers and a good view of the street. He received them with the expression of a man who had been expecting a confrontation and had dressed for it. "Mr. Keller," he said. "Miss Covington." "We've come to ask you to perform the ceremony," Hugh said, sitting down without being invited and indicating the chair next to him for Hazel, who sat with the straight-backed composure she always carried into difficult rooms. "The day after tomorrow at the church." The Reverend steepled his fingers. "I have reservations," he began. "I'm sure you do," Hugh said. "I'd like to hear them." This seemed to catch the Reverend somewhat off guard. He had expected, perhaps, resistance or defensiveness, not invitation. He cleared his throat. "Miss Covington's history with this town includes circumstances that—" "Her history with this town," Hugh said, still pleasantly, still in that voice that was polite and completely immovable, "consists of losing her father, finding work to support herself, and being treated with considerable unkindness by a community that should have done better by her. I am not aware of anything in her actual conduct that merits reservation." "She worked at the Silver Spur," the Reverend said, as though this settled something. "She kept the books," Hugh said. "You know the difference, Reverend, even if you've chosen not to acknowledge it." The Reverend's pale eyes moved to Hazel. "Are you certain this is what you want, Miss Covington? A man of Mr. Keller's character?" "Reverend," she said, quietly but with the clarity of someone who has been deciding what to say for a long time, "you stood on the steps of this church and you told 40 people that no decent man would have me. I have thought about that every day since. I am here today because I want you to understand, and I want God and this town to understand, that what you said was wrong. Not about Hugh, about me. I am a decent woman. I have always been a decent woman. And I deserve to be married in a church by a man of God just as much as anyone else in this county." She paused. The Reverend was very still. "If you will not do it," she said, "then we will go to Mescal Creek and we will be married by the justice of the peace, and we will come back to Dusthaven and continue to live here as we intend to do, and the town will simply have to make its peace with that. But I am asking you, directly and without anger, to do what you are supposed to do." There was a silence. The Reverend looked at her and then at Hugh and then out his window at the street, and something moved through him that was difficult to read. He was a small man in many ways, this was true, and he had done things in his time as pastor of this church that had been less about God and more about the preferences of wealthy women like Mrs. Whitmore. But there was, buried under the smallness, something that had once wanted to be a minister for honest reasons, and Hazel Covington's clear gray gaze seemed to have located it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The day after tomorrow." Hazel nodded once. Hugh said, "Thank you, Reverend," in a tone that was not sarcastic, which made it more effective. They left the church and walked back toward the assay office in the sharp spring light, and Hazel's hand was in the crook of Hugh's arm and she was not yet speaking, and he waited. "I did not think he would agree," she said after a block. "Neither did I, truthfully," he said. "Was that reckless, going in there?" "Almost certainly," he said, "but I think you were right to do it." She looked up at him. "You were very good in there." "You were better," he said. She held his arm more tightly and looked at the road ahead of them and thought, with a clarity that was close to joy, that she was going to marry this man and make a life with him in this desert town that had been unkind to both of them, and that the life was going to be a good one. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky so blue it seemed painted, the kind of mid-March sky in New Mexico that is its own argument for the beauty of the world. Hazel wore the blue dress, the one she had altered and remade for herself, because it was the best thing she owned and because she had made it herself and that mattered to her. She had put her hair up with 2 small pins that had belonged to her mother, which were the most valuable things in her possession. Lou Faber stood with Hugh as witness. Declan Fogarty came, which surprised Hazel and moved her quietly because it was a show of loyalty that cost him something. 3 of the working women who had hired her for sewing came, because she had treated them with courtesy and they remembered it. Mrs. Delacroix, who had let Hazel the room above the hardware store before the Reverend's influence had reached her, came too, and she looked somewhat ashamed of herself, which was appropriate. The church had perhaps 15 people in it when Reverend Croft began. It was not the full congregation, but it was witnesses, real ones, and the light came through the 2 plain windows at the front of the church and fell across the aisle in long bars of gold, and it was a real church ceremony, complete and proper, and Hazel stood at the front of it next to Hugh Keller and listened to the Reverend's words. He said the words correctly, and with a seriousness that suggested he had, at some point between their meeting in his office and this morning, thought about what those words meant. He did not editorialize. He did not add commentary. He performed the ceremony as it was written, and when he got to the part where he asked whether anyone present had cause to object, the church was completely silent, and Hugh looked at Hazel and she looked back at him and neither of them looked away. "Do you, Hugh James Keller, take this woman?" "I do," Hugh said, before the Reverend had quite finished the sentence, which made Hazel press her lips together to contain something. "Do you, Hazel Margaret Covington, take this man?" "I do," she said, clearly and without hesitation. Hugh put the gold band with the turquoise stone on her finger for the second time, and this time it was official, and the Reverend said the words that made it so. And Hugh took her face in both hands and kissed her the way a man kisses a woman when he intends it to be the first of many and wants her to know that. And the 15 people in the church made the sound of people who have witnessed something that was correct. They were married by 11 in the morning, well before dusk, but as they walked out of the church into the sharp blue day and Hugh took her hand on the steps and looked at her with the full force of that dark-eyed attention and said, "Mrs. Keller," she thought about what the Reverend had said those months ago on these same steps, about decent men, and she felt the irony of it settle into something that was not bitterness, but was close to satisfaction. Declan Fogarty had opened the Silver Spur early and had food laid out, and he played the fiddle himself, badly but with tremendous enthusiasm. And it was the kind of celebration that small frontier towns do well when they are not organized against someone, genuine and unpolished and warm. Hugh danced with her twice and then gave her to Lou Faber for a slow waltz and watched from the wall with his arms folded, and his face doing something that was not his usual expression, something more open than usual. Something that she caught him at when she looked over old Lou's shoulder and held his gaze from across the room. That evening they walked home to the assay office in the last of the light, their shadows long on the road, the desert going gold and then orange, and then the deep red that only the New Mexico desert achieves in the last minutes before dark. The mountains were very clear and very close-looking, the way mountains look sometimes in clear, dry air, as though you could walk to them in an afternoon. "Well," Hugh said, as they came to the door of the assay office. "Well," she agreed. "What would you like to do with the rest of your life, Mrs. Keller?" She considered the question seriously, because she was someone who took questions seriously. "I would like a garden," she said, "with a proper fence." And I would like to keep doing the books for Declan and anyone else who needs it, because I am good at it and I like it. And I would like to read all the books on your shelf and argue with you about them." "That is a comprehensive plan," he said. "I also," she said, turning to look at him in the last of the light, "would like to stay here in this desert in this life with you. That is the main part of it." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture that had become one of the most familiar things in her world over the past months, and he said, "That is exactly what we're going to do." The spring of 1883 in Dusthaven was a full season of change, and not only for Hugh and Hazel Keller. The railroad was coming, the same railroad they had argued about on their evening walks, and it was bringing with it a new kind of town, faster and louder, and less settled than the cattle drive town they had known. New businesses were opening on Main Street. New families were arriving. The Silver Spur expanded and became something closer to a hotel as well as a saloon. Lou Faber's assay office business increased considerably as mining interests in the mountains to the east began to be taken more seriously. Hugh found himself, almost without intending to, in the position of a man who had enough capital and enough connections and enough careful intelligence to take advantage of the new opportunities without being swept under by them. He partnered with Declan on the hotel expansion. He acquired a proper interest in the assay office when Lou's health made the older man want to reduce his involvement. He was becoming, in the specific way of frontier towns in the Gilded Age, something approaching a businessman which amused him. Hazel was building her own practice. The bookkeeping work had expanded to 5 businesses by April, and she had taken on a young woman named Esperanza as an assistant with the sewing work, a girl of 17 from the Mexican family that farmed the land south of town, a girl with quick hands and a quicker mind, whom Hazel was quietly teaching not only sewing but also reading and numbers, because it was the right thing to do, and because Hazel had decided that if she had any standing in this town, she would use it for something useful. She had her garden. Hugh had built the fence himself over 3 weekends in April, a proper wooden fence with a gate that latched properly, and she had planted it with what she could get from the seed merchant, and what Esperanza's mother had brought over in small cloth bags, tomatoes and squash, and the 2 rose bushes that she had ordered specifically from a nursery in Kansas City by letter, the same variety her grandmother had grown. They would not bloom until summer, the rose bushes, but they were there, planted properly in the good dark earth she had worked herself, and every morning she stood in the garden with her coffee and looked at them with a satisfaction that was difficult to put into words. Hugh stood with her some mornings looking at the garden, and he had a habit of looking at her as much as the garden when he did it, which she had noticed and which she did not mind at all. Reverend Croft remained in Dusthaven. He did not become a different man exactly, but he became, after the wedding, a somewhat quieter one. He had, Hazel thought, been changed by something in their confrontation in his office and in the ceremony itself, some reminder of what he had originally meant to be. And while she would not have called him a friend or even an ally, she would have said that the weapon of his pulpit was no longer aimed quite so specifically at her. He preached against gambling still, and against drinking, and once against certain business practices that seemed pointed at Hugh's card table, but the personal campaigns had lost some of their fervor. Mrs. Whitmore was harder, but Mrs. Whitmore's sphere of influence contracted in direct proportion to the expansion of Hugh and Hazel's standing in the new Dusthaven, and by summer the woman's opinions were still heard, but were no longer the deciding factor in anyone's social calculations. Thomas Whitmore himself came to Hazel's sewing table in May with a broken watch chain and a look of someone who needed to say something. She fixed the chain, and he stood there holding the repaired piece in his soft hands and said, awkwardly and with sincerity, "I should have said something. When my mother and the Reverend, I should have said something in your defense." "Yes," she said simply, without cruelty. "But you didn't, and that tells you something about yourself that you'll have to decide what to do with." He looked at her with something that was recognition and shame in equal measure, and nodded, and paid for the chain repair and left. She did not despise him for his weakness, but she also did not forgive it in the way that smoothed everything over and pretended it had not happened. Hugh heard about the exchange from Declan, who heard it from Esperanza, who had been in the shop during it. Hugh said nothing directly, but that evening at dinner he looked at her with a particular expression and said, "I heard Whitmore came by." "He did," she said. "Are you satisfied with how it went?" She thought about it. "I am, yes," she said. "Good," he said, and passed her the bread, and that was the end of it. In June she told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning, which was where they told each other important things, and she watched his face carefully because she was always watching his face. She had learned to read it with the same attention she gave to a column of numbers, and what she saw there was not alarm or calculation, or the particular withdrawal of a man who was about to become complicated about something. What she saw was something that came up from behind his usual expression and filled it completely, something that was, she thought, the same thing she felt when she looked at her rose bushes in the morning, a kind of deep gladness that did not need to announce itself. He reached across the table and took her hand. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "A little nauseous in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise quite well." "Then we'll manage the nausea," he said, with the same practicality he brought to every problem. And then he stood up and came around the table and sat beside her and held her properly. "The way you hold something you are profoundly grateful to have." And she leaned against him, and the morning light came in the kitchen window and fell across the table and the coffee cups, and outside the garden was green, and the roses were coming into their first small buds. July of 1883 was hot and full of work, and Hazel kept at the bookkeeping and the sewing through the heat because she was not a woman who stopped working because of inconvenience, and because the work was hers and she loved it. Hugh had taken to coming to the office where she kept her accounts in the afternoons and sitting nearby with his own papers, not intruding, just present, and she found it pleasant, the particular company of a person you love working beside you, the shared space of useful activity. Lou Faber's health declined further in August, and Hugh bought out his remaining share in the assay office, and what had been a business arrangement became an outright ownership. And he came home that evening and told Hazel, and she said, "You will need a proper manager for the operation." And he said, "I was thinking the same thing." And they looked at each other across the dinner table, and she said, "Are you asking me?" And he said, "I am asking you." And she said, "Then yes." And they spent the next hour talking through how it would work, and it was one of the best conversations they had, which was saying something because they had many good ones. She managed the assay office from a desk in the front office, keeping the books and handling the correspondence and the legal matters, and it was well suited to her. The combination of precision and the variety of problems that came through the mining business. And she was good at it, quickly and visibly good at it. And the men who came in with ore samples and land questions and title concerns learned fast that Hazel Keller was the person to speak to if you wanted a straight answer. September came, the anniversary of that first terrible church meeting, the anniversary of Hugh's cigarette and his coffee, and his watching her walk away with her back straight. They did not make a ceremony of it. They walked out in the evening to the flat land east of town, where the desert was going its late summer gold, and Hazel put her hand through Hugh's arm and they walked in the long evening light. And she thought about that woman of a year ago who had sat on the church steps and listened to a small man say small things about her, and she felt for that woman a tenderness that was close to grief and close to pride. "What are you thinking?" Hugh asked, because he always knew when she was thinking something particular. "I am thinking about a year ago," she said, "and about how different things are." "Better?" he asked, with a slight smile that said he knew the answer. "Incomparably better," she said, and then, "I am thinking about what you said outside the church that morning, about the Reverend being a small man in a big coat. It was true. It was kind," she said. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in months, and you barely knew me." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew enough," he said. "I knew you were worth knowing better." She leaned against his arm as they walked. The desert was going gold around them, and the evening was warm, and far ahead the mountains were clear against the fading sky. "I am glad you were the least decent man in town," she said. He laughed. "I am too, as it turns out." Their son was born in February of 1884, in the middle of a cold, clear night, with the help of the town's doctor and Esperanza's mother, who was a practical and capable woman, and who had delivered many children in her time. Hugh was in the next room and was not, he would later admit freely, managing his composure particularly well, pacing and failing to read the book he had brought as though reading were going to be a realistic activity under the circumstances. When the doctor brought him in and he saw Hazel lying in the warm lamplight with the child in her arms, he stopped in the doorway and looked at them, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. All the careful armor of 10 years of frontier living simply absent. Just Hugh, looking at her, and the child with an openness that was close to awe. She held out her arm and he came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his hands, and he held his son with a careful, complete concentration, looking at him as though memorizing the details, which she recognized because it was exactly the way he had looked at her in those early months, in the way she had caught him at across a room. "Edmund," she said, "for my father, if that's all right." He looked up at her. "Edmund Hugh Keller," he said, as though tasting the shape of the name. "That is exactly right." She reached up and touched his face, the strong line of his jaw that had healed slightly wrong, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and the baby made a small, indignant sound, and they both looked down at him, and Hazel laughed, softly, the real laugh, the deep one. Dusthaven in 1884 was not the same town it had been 2 years before. The railroad had arrived in October of 1883, and the town had grown fast and rough around its edges. New streets and new faces, and the particular energy of a place that was becoming something rather than already being it. Hugh's business interests had expanded alongside the town's growth, the hotel doing well, the assay office at the center of the new mining activity in the eastern mountains, and he had added a small freighting operation that ran goods between Dusthaven and 3 other towns on the new rail line. Hazel ran the accounts for all of it, from her office in the front of the assay building, with Edmund in a cradle near her desk, and Esperanza, now 18 and seriously competent, handling the sewing work mostly independently and learning bookkeeping in the afternoons. Hazel had decided, some months ago, that what she was actually doing with Esperanza was teaching, and that this was one of the most satisfying things she did, and she was making plans to formalize it, to find a way to create something more structured, a school or at least a study program, for the young women in the town and the ranches nearby who had no access to the education that would give them real options. She talked about it with Hugh over dinner one evening, laying out the plan with the precision she brought to all plans, and he listened with his full attention and asked good questions, and when she was done he said, "What do you need to make it happen?" she told him. He nodded and said, "Then let's do it," and that was the extent of the negotiation. The school opened, informally, in a room off the assay office in the spring of 1884. 6 young women to start, ranging from Esperanza's age to older, some of them with families and domestic work that limited their hours. Hazel taught reading and numbers and basic legal literacy, the kind of knowledge about land titles and contracts and rights that she had wished she had had when her father died and left her alone in a territory she barely knew. It was not a formal school, but it was something real, and it met 3 mornings a week, and word spread quietly, and by summer there were 12 students. Reverend Croft came one morning. Hazel looked up from her work to find him standing in the doorway of the schoolroom with his hat in his hands, watching her teach. She held his gaze. He did not flinch from it this time. "I owe you an apology," he said when the lesson was done and the students had gone. She waited. "What I said," he began. "From the church steps. It was not right." He stopped. He was a man who found apology as uncomfortable as changing his bones. She could see it. "I allowed myself to be influenced by interests that were not pastoral in nature. I allowed it to shape what I said from the pulpit and what I said publicly, and I was wrong." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the woman on those steps, the straightened back, the long walk home. She thought about all the months of it. She thought about what forgiveness was for and who it served. "I appreciate that," she said. "It is not easy to say." "It is not," he agreed. "I accept it," she said. "I will not pretend it didn't happen or that it didn't matter, but I accept it." He nodded and put his hat back on and started to leave, and then he turned back and looked at the room she had made, the table and the chairs and the small chalkboard Hugh had built into the wall, and he said, "What you are doing here is a good thing, Mrs. Keller." She looked at the room too. "Yes," she said simply. "I know." He left. She stood in the small schoolroom for a moment, and then she went back to her desk and her accounts, and the morning went on. The autumn of 1884 was a full, warm season, and by October Edmund was 8 months old and beginning to pull himself upright on anything he could reach, including Hugh's boots and the legs of the kitchen table, and once memorably, the fence post in the garden. He had Hugh's dark eyes and Hazel's determined chin, and a personality that combined both these qualities into something that was, they agreed, going to require a tremendous amount of patience to raise, and would probably be absolutely worth it. The rose bushes in the garden had bloomed twice that year and would bloom once more before the cold came, and they were exactly the variety she remembered from her grandmother's yard in Kansas City, the deep red-pink color, and the particular scent that she associated with the idea of home. She cut them sometimes and put them in a jar on the kitchen table, and the kitchen smelled of roses over the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and it was, she thought, the smell of the life she had imagined in her notebook and then had been careful enough and brave enough to actually build. Hugh was in the garden with her one evening in late October when Edmund had been put to bed and the day's work was done, sitting on the bench he had built against the fence, and the stars were coming out overhead in that particular New Mexico abundance that never quite became ordinary no matter how long you looked at it. "Are you happy?" she asked him. She did not ask it anxiously. She asked it the way she asked things when she genuinely wanted to know, directly and without performance. He looked at the stars for a moment and then at her, and his face was the open face, the one she had first seen when he held Edmund for the first time, the one she saw more often now, the armor being worn less constantly as it was needed less. "Genuinely, yes," he said, "more than I expected to be." "What did you expect?" she asked. He considered it. "Less," he said. "I expected to be fine, comfortable, managing. I did not expect to be happy in the way I am." "Which way is that?" He reached over and took her hand in the dark, the turquoise ring cool and smooth under his fingers. "The kind that doesn't require anything else to be different," he said. "The kind where this is enough, all of it, as it is." She turned her hand over and held his. Above them the stars were extravagant and the desert was quiet around the fence, and inside the house their son was sleeping, and the rose bushes were dark shapes against the pale fence, and the coffee was waiting on the stove inside, and she thought of her notebook and the list she had kept and what she had written in it, and how the actual life had turned out to be larger and stranger and more completely itself than anything a list could capture. "Hugh," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am going to spend the rest of my life being glad that you were leaning against that porch post." He was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed the real laugh, and she laughed too, and in the house Edmund stirred briefly at the sound of it and then settled back to sleep, and the stars went on overhead in their vast and indifferent beauty, and the two of them sat in the garden their life had made and held the warmth of it between them. By the spring of 1885, the school and the assay office had grown enough that Hazel had begun a formal application to the territorial government for designation as an educational institution, which would bring with it certain protections and the possibility of proper funding. The application required a letter from a civic leader, and it was Hugh who had the standing in the community by that point, and he wrote the letter without being asked, and without consulting her first, which she discovered when the territorial education official who processed applications wrote back mentioning the detailed and enthusiastic letter of support from Mr. H.J. Keller, businessman, Dusthaven, New Mexico Territory. She found the copy of his letter in his desk when she was looking for a different document, and she read it in its entirety, all 4 pages of it, and it was the most eloquent document Hugh Keller had ever produced, a thorough and passionate account of what Hazel's school was doing and why it mattered and what it meant for the young women of the territory. And it was, she thought, folding it and putting it back, also an inadvertent and complete portrait of how he saw her, the whole of her. The intelligence and the work and the resilience and the vision, laid out in plain language by a man who had been paying the best kind of attention. She did not mention finding it for 3 days. Then one evening she said, as though it had been on her mind for a while, which it had, "You wrote to the territory about the school." He looked up from his book. "I did, without telling me. I wanted to do something for you that was mine to do," he said. "You manage the accounts, you teach the students, you ran the legal correspondence. There was not much left that I could contribute." She looked at him for a long moment. 4 pages, she said. He almost smiled. There was a great deal to say. She crossed the room and kissed him, and he put his book down and held her, and outside the spring wind was moving through the garden, and the roses were coming up again in their particular deep red, and Edmund was in his room talking to himself in the self-important way of a toddler discovering that language is a tool, and the future was a wide thing, full of specific and ordinary and remarkable days. The territorial designation came through in July of 1885. Hazel Keller's School, formerly named the Covington Keller School for Women of the Territory, was now a recognized educational institution, which meant it could receive donations, apply for support, and operate with a formal standing that protected it from being simply shut down by someone's preference. She stood in the front room of the assay office on the morning the letter arrived and read it twice, and then set it down on the desk and looked out the window at Main Street, at the town that had told her she was not worth having, and she felt the vindication of it, clean and complete. And then she felt something better than vindication, which was the knowledge that the school was not about proving anything to anyone. It was about the 12 young women who would come through that door this morning and learn something that would give them a choice they had not had before. That was the point. That was the whole of it. She put the letter in the proper file and went to make coffee. Hugh was at the kitchen table already reading a letter from his mother in St. Louis, and he looked up and read her face immediately in the way he had become expert at reading her. "It came through," he said. "It came through," she said. He set his mother's letter down and reached for her hand and said, simply and with the full weight of his meaning, "Well done, Hazel." She poured her coffee and sat down across from him and said, "Your mother writes often lately. Is everything well?" "She's thinking of coming west," he said, with the particular tone of someone who is pleased and trying not to show it too directly. "She wants to meet you, and Edmund." Hazel looked at him. She had heard a great deal about Meredith Keller over the past 2 years, from Hugh's stories, and from the letters she had sometimes found him writing late at night, long, careful letters to a woman who had clearly done her best under difficult circumstances to raise a son who was better than his circumstances suggested. "I would like to meet her very much," Hazel said. Meredith Keller arrived in Dusthaven in September of 1885, on the train from Albuquerque, a woman of 58 with gray-streaked hair and Hugh's dark eyes, and the straight-backed composure that told you immediately where her son had learned it. She stepped off the train with a single large bag and looked at Hugh and then at Hazel and Edmund with the expression of a woman who has been worrying about something for a long time and has just seen that the worry was unnecessary. She embraced Hugh first, briefly and fiercely, and then she turned to Hazel and took both her hands and looked at her with those dark eyes that were so much like Hugh's but older and more openly worn by experience. "My son wrote me about you," she said. at length. On many occasions, he mentioned that, Hazel said. He said you were the most remarkable woman he had ever known, Meredith said, in the direct way of a woman who has nothing left to lose by being direct. From what I can see, he was conservative. Hazel looked at Hugh, who was looking somewhere else with great interest. Then she looked back at Meredith and said, I think he is also fairly remarkable for what it is worth. Meredith smiled, and it was Hugh's smile, the real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine. Yes, she said. He turned out well. I was not always certain he would. She stayed 3 weeks, long enough for Edmund to become completely devoted to her, long enough for Hazel to discover in her a companion of real quality, a woman who had read as widely as either of them and had thought carefully about the world and was not given to pretending things were other than they were. She came to the school and sat at the back and watched Hazel teach, and afterwards said, You should write this down. What you are doing here and how you are doing it. Other places need it. Hazel thought about that for a long time after Meredith had gone back to St. Louis. In the evenings after Meredith's departure, the house felt its normal self again. The three of them, Edmund and Hugh and Hazel, the particular domestic weather of a family that is genuinely happy in its own company. She and Hugh had taken to reading together after Edmund's bedtime, not always the same book but in the same room, and the evenings were quiet and warm, and she thought sometimes that this was the thing she had written in her notebook all those months ago, the room that was hers that no one could remove her from, except it was larger than a room, and it was made of living rather than architecture, and it was more than she had known to want when she wrote it down. In the spring of 1886, she was expecting their second child, and this time she told Hugh over breakfast before the morning had properly begun, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, the unguarded gladness, and she thought that this was the thing about Hugh Keller that no one had told her when they told her he was the least decent man in town. He was, in fact, when it came to the things that mattered, entirely capable of the most honest and complete of responses. The armor was for the world that had never given him reason to take it off. She had given him reason, and he had taken it off, and what was underneath was someone who felt things fully and without apology. Their daughter was born in October of 1886, a clear, cold October morning, and she was smaller than Edmund had been but louder, which Hugh said was going to be interesting, and Hazel said was going to be a quality that served her well. They named her Rose, for the garden and the grandmother's flowers and the deep red blooms that came up every spring in the Dusthaven soil, and she had Hazel's gray eyes and her grandmother Meredith's straight back and absolutely no intention, from the very first morning of her life, of being overlooked. The school was growing by the time Rose could walk, had expanded to a second room and had a second teacher, a young man named Bridges who had come through Dusthaven on his way somewhere else and stayed because there was work, and because Hazel had hired him and he was good at what he did. There were 23 students now, young women from the town and the surrounding ranches and farms, and 3 of them had gone on to professional work of various kinds, one to accounting, one to teaching in a neighboring town, one who was running her father's dry goods business after his death with a competence that surprised everyone except Hazel. Hugh had occasion once to say, to a man from Denver who had come through on business and who had made a slightly condescending remark about the town's facilities, that Dusthaven had one of the finest small educational institutions in the territory, and that its founder was his wife, and the way he said it had the same quality as that morning in his study, when she had found the letter to the territory, the simple and complete and unperforming pride of a man who was genuinely glad of who he was married to. Reverend Croft retired in 1887, and the new minister who came to the Dusthaven Baptist Church was a younger man with a less sharp nose and eyes that seemed interested in people rather than disappointed by them, and he called on Hugh and Hazel in their first week in town and was, Hazel thought, the kind of pastor the church had needed all along. By 1888, Dusthaven had grown into something that was part of the New West rather than the Old, the railroad and the mining and the cattle ranches all existing together, the town neither purely frontier nor yet fully modern. Hugh and Hazel Keller were, by any accounting, one of the central families of it, not because they had sought prominence, but because they had done real things that mattered to real people, and the town had taken note of that in the slow way that communities acknowledge those who serve them well. On a September evening in 1888, 6 years after the morning that had changed everything, Hugh and Hazel walked out to the flat land east of town where they had walked before, where the flowers came up in the spring and the mountains were always clear. Edmund was 6 and a half, at home with Esperanza, who was now fully Hazel's partner in the school and the acknowledged authority on most sewing matters in the county, and Rose was nearly 2, and was at home sleeping with the particular determination of someone who has decided that sleep is currently their project. They walked without talking for a time, the way they could, the desert quiet around them in the warm September evening, the sky going from gold to orange to the first pale blue of dusk. "Do you remember what you said to me," Hazel began, "when you came to me that first morning with the offer of the room?" "I remember everything about that morning," he said. "You said that I had never once cared what people said about me, that you figured that was a quality that might suit my situation." "I did say that," he agreed. "You were right about that," she said. "Though I was not as indifferent as I appeared, I cared more than I showed." "I know," he said. "I knew then too." She looked at him. "You did. The way you walked down those steps," he said. "You cared very much. You were just not going to let them see it." That was the thing that he paused, in the way he paused when he was deciding how much of something to say. That was the thing that made me pay attention, not the dismissal of it, the refusal to be broken by it. She walked for a moment with that. The mountains were very clear ahead of them, purple-blue in the falling light. "Hugh," she said, "yes. I have been thinking about what Meredith said about writing it down, what we are doing at the school. And I think she was right," she said. "I think it could be something that other places could use, not just a local school, a model, something that could be written out and sent out and replicated." He was quiet, thinking about it with her, which was what he always did before he said anything useful. "That would be significant work," he said. "Yes," she said, "but I think it is the right work." "Then we make the time for it," he said, simply. As though significant work was simply a matter of making room for it, which she had come to understand was exactly how Hugh Keller thought about things he believed in. She reached for his hand in the dark of the early evening and he took it, and they stood for a moment facing the mountains with the last of the light behind them, the desert stretching out in every direction, wild and enormous and old, the territory that had been hard on both of them and that they had both, in their different ways, refused to let define them as less than they were. She thought of all of it, the full chain of it, the church steps and the cigarette and the coffee cup and the bolt on the door, the Thoreau and the cold night and the frayed cuff of the shirt, the dance and the Reverend's pale eyes and Hugh's voice, perfectly civil and completely immovable, the turquoise ring in the desert light, the wedding and Lou Faber's gentle waltz and Declan's badly played fiddle, Edmund being born and placed in Hugh's hands, the rose bushes coming up every spring, the school and the letter to the territory and Meredith's dark eyes reading her across the platform. Rose, who would not be overlooked, already making that plain at less than 2 years old, and Hugh through all of it. Hugh, who had leaned against a post on a September morning and listened to a small man say something cruel about a woman he barely knew and had felt something shift in his chest, and had let that shift lead where it needed to lead, without demanding it be something other than it was, without the armor up and the distance maintained. Hugh, who had offered the room and installed the bolt and left the coffee cup and carried her parcels and stood between her and the Reverend without being asked. Hugh, who had read 4 pages about her to the territorial government and wrote long letters home to his mother and held his son like something extraordinary and was, underneath every other quality he had, a man of absolute and unwavering loyalty to the things and people he had chosen. He had been called the least decent man in town. She had, for one terrible morning, been told that no decent man would have her. Neither of those things had turned out to be quite right, which she supposed was the point. She held his hand in the desert, and the mountains went from purple to black, and the first stars came out over the flat rim of the world, the same stars that had been there on all the other evenings, and the same stars that would be there long after Dusthaven had changed again into whatever it was going to become next. "Come home," she said. "Yes," he said. And they turned and walked back through the September dark toward the lights of the town, the two of them and the life they had made and the lives that waited for them in the warm house. And the road was familiar under their feet, and the air was clean, and the stars were out, and there was nothing unresolved between them, nothing left undone that needed doing tonight, nothing in the wide dark of the territory that was not, in its way, exactly as it should be. The roses bloomed again the following spring, as they did every spring, as Hazel had always believed they would, deep red and certain against the pale fence, in the garden with the proper fence and the latching gate, in the desert town that had once been unkind and had since been given the chance to do better, in the life that had been built out of coffee cups and clear-eyed decisions, and a gambler's complete refusal to accept that some things couldn't be changed. Edmund helped her water them on the spring mornings, serious about it in the way of children given a real task, and Rose watched from the kitchen step with her grandmother Meredith straight back in Hugh's dark eyes, and Hugh stood at the fence watching all three of them with the open face, the unguarded one, and Hazel caught him at it across the garden and held his gaze, and the morning was warm and the roses were open, and the mountains were clear on the horizon, and everything, every last thing, was exactly right.